Zoe Brown is a senior fair housing coordinator at Project Sentinel and oversees all City of San Jose fair housing complaints. She has been a member of the Fair Housing Department of Project Sentinel for almost 2.5 years. During that time, has handled approximately 150 full-fledged fair housing complaints. She's with us tonight to speak on the topic of protecting atheists with fair housing laws. So please join me in welcoming Zoe Brown.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, guys, for having me today. I can definitely vouch for the fact that Downtown Streets team is a fantastic group. They're one of my favorite groups that my organization does partner with, and I meet with them regularly. And so they have, they have their staff members and then their team members. I don't know if it was clear, but those are the actual people who they're serving, who they bring in, get involved in work, and then give them kind of, compensation in one form or another to kind of help support them get out of, the homeless state that they're in of that moment. And so it's great. My organization has done trainings for their team members and for their staff. And I guess a little bit about myself, I guess I would just mention, is I have an extensive background in terms of housing law work. I used to do international human rights law work related to the right to shelter, to housing, and then I went to law school, and then I, of course, now am very much about the civil right to housing. And also on a personal note, I was raised by a staunch atheist and an agnostic, but my mother, the agnostic, was more just provocative, and she said she believed in aliens, if anything. So essentially, and by two strong secularists. So I was actually very excited to find out about this group personally, in addition to the fact that my organization is all about, autonomy and free choice in most regards. And so generally when I give presentations too, I have a good sense of who I'm speaking to. Downtown Streets team people, for instance, I know the kind of people that I'm talking to. But here it seems like it's more diverse. I actually wanted to start by just asking, first, how many people here actually are involved in as a landlord or a manager with regards to housing? So I know there's one landlord in the crowd. Are there any others? Okay. All right, maybe, quasi. All right, well, we'll determine whether or not you have to pay attention to these laws. It doesn't cover everybody. And then also just a question out there, do they think they've actually experienced discrimination? In any instance, whether it was housing or employment or just something, on the street, for instance. Yeah, okay. All right, does anyone want to tell a little bit about their story, about their experience? Do you want to right here in the front? Yeah, just briefly. So what type of discrimination do you think you experienced?
So I'm Asian, so actually the most interesting discrimination is more to do with my name, and it has to do with my race.
Mm-hmm.
My last name is Washington, so there's a lot of assumptions. My skin color is a little darker than it is.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people who think that I'm black when they first see me, Sean Washington. So
yeah.
So that's what I get experience.
Yeah. In what particular instance? It was just someone surprised when they met you in person, or?
Yeah, that's mostly it.
Okay.
Like, say if I'm going to an interview,
Yeah.
I'm Sean Washington.
Yeah.
Oh, you are.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll wait here.
Yeah.
It's not been that bad.
Yeah. Okay. Just curious to hear too, because sometimes I'll tell friends or what I do, and they're like, "Oh, do we still actually have discrimination? We're past that, right?" No, there's a lot of it out there, and yes.
I had a boss who was strongly Christian and trying to convert me, and it was still really uncomfortable because I
Yeah.
kind of reacted. If you contradicted me, I might lose
Yeah.
pay grade or something. So
Absolutely.
not discrimination, but just
Yeah.
really uncomfortable.
Potentially, and that's also just one thing, and then I'll let you speak. But that's also why. So there are the fair housing laws, which they prohibit housing discrimination, and there also are the fair employment laws, because those are two instances where you have these uneven power structures. Where one person is more elevated than another, and that's where. It's much where the person who has less power needs to have a little bit more protection and confidence so that they can do what they need to do, whether it's get housing or do their job without, feeling, pressure or being treated unfairly. So I think you had your hand up over there too.
I used to live in Hermosa Beach, which is a great town, but it's
That's
extremely white. And I was talking to my landlady one time. I said, I have a friend that I work with that's looking for a place if you got anything. And the first thing she said was, is he black?
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty bad. Yes. Again, so another example of this is why my organization works and why we're kept so busy. So I'm going to go into a little bit of what's a more general presentation, just an overview of the fair housing laws or the housing discrimination laws. And then I am going to focus in a little bit more on the protected category that's religion, which also includes people who are non-religious, and that's obviously why I'm here today, and to talk about a particular case which also prompted me seeking you guys out and wanting to talk to this audience. All right, so hopefully, even though I'm not talking about your particular group the entire time, I think you might take away some helpful information, you know, for family and friends, because this is a pervasive issue. So briefly too, so my organization is a nonprofit organization, and the simplest way of describing us is that we help people with housing situations. We have a lot of different departments. So I'm from the Fair Housing or the Housing Discrimination Department, but we have a lot of other departments. So if you have any type of housing issue, I encourage you to give us a call. All of our services are free except for first-time homebuyer classes. There's a small fee for that, but everything else is free advice, free counsel. Almost everyone in our organization are lawyers by training, so we know what we're talking about. And yeah, so some of the other closely related departments that I would highlight to mine is landlord tenant counseling, so that's issues about lease agreements, breaking leases, security deposit returns, repairs, all that kind of stuff. And then another helpful department that we have is our mediation dispute resolution. That's also a free service. So if you're having an issue with a neighbor where you're living or with your landlord or your manager, you can decide, you know, instead of going into court and wasting money and stress and all that, you can come and our organization will provide you a mediator and try and resolve a housing dispute in that way. This map, that is very, okay, there we go. This kind of shows the area that we cover, but we're actually always expanding beyond here. So we're San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, we're over in the East Bay. You can see we now are all the way out, not past, or we're past like Stanislaus County, Modesto area. We're also going into Sacramento, and we are now going far south down to Monterey County. So we're the largest fair housing agency and an agency of our kind in Northern California. This was not created by me, and I am always impatient with how slow it is. Briefly, this is just a roadmap for people. It tells you a little bit about the things I'm going to talk about. But I think I'm just going to jump right into it. And I don't know why it's doing this. Okay. We had an intern working on this, and he was into all the snazzy things. And I was like, I don't want any photos. I don't want any fancy stuff. To go back to the basics. So this actually, right now, we only have the Federal Fair Housing Act on here. And it's been around for quite some time, as you can see. It was passed not long after the Civil Rights Act. And essentially what it does is it protects certain groups of people from being discriminated against in their attempt to acquire housing or to fully use and enjoy their housing once somebody is in their housing. And that's what it's about. It's about making sure that they have the same full and equal ability to use and enjoy their housing. And the particular groups that have been highlighted by this act are the groups that historically have been discriminated against. So there's that. And there's also a California fair housing law, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, or FEHA, that's not listed here, but I'm also going to talk about. Okay, now that we got that up there. Okay, so on the right, these are the protected categories under the federal law. So everybody all across the U.S. cannot discriminate based on these categories. So we call them categories, but they're more like characteristics or traits that people will have. And you can't be treated differently with regards to having one of these traits. So you can't be treated differently because of the color of your skin or your race. According to the federal government, there are 3 races, by the way, white, black, and Asian. So that's what's being referred to there. All the others are ethnicities. So you also cannot be discriminated against because of your country of origin. That's what national origin is about. And something else I always like to highlight here, because I think it's so fantastic, because most laws in the United States protect U.S. citizens. However, this law protects all people residing in the U.S. with regards to the right to housing. So you can be an undocumented immigrant, and you are still protected under these laws. Of course, many of them are still too timid to kind of bring to light their complaints, but technically under the law, they are protected from discrimination. And a court's not supposed to ask because it's not relevant, their immigration status. So religion, which I'm going to talk about some more, which includes not only protecting people based on their religion, but also those who are non-religious. Gender is another protected category, disability, and then familial status protects families with minor children. And that's one that most people haven't heard of, and they might think doesn't really exist, but actually there's a fair amount of discrimination. It's, at this point, I'd say the second or third most common category or most common type of case that we get, where a lot of housing providers don't want to rent to someone with a large family, or young children, or those kind of things. And of course, those families need to find housing just like anybody else does. So if the landlord is being overly restrictive in terms of refusing to rent to a family of 4 versus 4 adults, then it could be discrimination. And so then on the right-hand side, these are the additional categories that are protected under California, California being the great liberal state that it is. So we also protect people based on their marital status, so you can't be turned away because you are single versus married. We see that more often than you may think, because people have this stereotype that married couples are more stable and they'll be around longer, but of course people can get divorced, so it doesn't mean anything, so it shouldn't matter. And also I'd say marital status discrimination comes up in the instance of an unmarried couple if the landlord is more conservative and is imposing their own beliefs on the person. Because a general rule of thumb that I give landlords when I'm talking to them is that you have a concern for having a reliable tenant who can afford to pay the rent and will pay the rent every month and won't engage in criminal activity on the property. Anything else is not your business, and so if you put any other, requirements on that person or inquire about anything else, it's probably discriminatory. So going back to the California protected categories, sexual orientation, that includes gays, lesbians, transgender, and it can also include people who are straight but assumed to be, gay and then treated negatively because of that assumption. So you don't necessarily have to be that, it's just how you're perceived. And then age is another one that is more common than one might expect. I've had a couple of cases recently where housing providers did not want to rent to elderly people because they were worried that the people would die in their apartment, and then they wouldn't be able to rent it out to others. So that's age discrimination. Source of income is about the idea that a landlord does have a right, again, to make sure that a person can pay for the apartment, and they can ask for 3 times rent, 4 times rent. I actually haven't heard any parameters in terms of what's too much in terms of double or triple the rent, but the key is the source should not matter. If the amount is appropriate, it doesn't matter if that source is a pension, savings, public benefits. That's the most common way we see it, where people have these negative stereotypes about people who receive Social Security or SSDI. But it's about the amount and, again, not the source. And then arbitrary is this extra category that California has for things that just seem kind of shady, but we're not sure where else to put them. So if a person has any other kind of negative assumption about a person that doesn't seem to have a bearing on that person's ability to be a good tenant, then it could be couched as arbitrary discrimination. So I think if we didn't have the religion category, we would probably put atheists under there. That seems arbitrary. What someone believes or does not believe has no bearing on their ability to be a good tenant. Most commonly, though, we see cases that are couched as arbitrary when a person, has dyed hair or a lot of piercings or tattoos, and it's, again, these things that have no bearing on their ability to be a good tenant, but that make people assume that there's negative stereotypes about them, that they are going to engage in criminal activity or be irresponsible or, any number of negative things associated. So those are the key statuses or traits that are protected. And then dwellings, in terms of where do you apply these laws? What type of housing? What counts as a house? It's a very, very broad category. Any building intended for occupancy as a residence by one or more person. It should be persons. And so this intended for occupancy, it actually is intended for occupancy both based on the landlord's perception and actually the tenants. So I've seen cases where, you know, if a landlord sets a place up with electricity and running water and those kind of things, then whatever it actually looks like, you know, if it's a shed in the backyard or a garage that actually has those minimum things that are needed for a place to be habitable, it would probably count as a dwelling. On the flip side, if a tenant starts to leave their belongings there and has an expectation to return to the same place daily basis, maybe receives mail there, they're also setting that place up as a dwelling, as a place that counts. And so because this definition of dwelling is so broad, a homeless shelter, that is not a lottery-based one. So some homeless shelters, every single day you show up, put your name on a list and see if you can get a bed. Those ones, you have no expectation of returning on a daily basis, so they don't count as a dwelling. But other homeless shelters where you're given a bed for a couple of weeks or longer, that would actually count as a dwelling, and so those people in that space are also protected from experiencing housing discrimination. A hotel, if a person stays at a hotel for a longer period of time, that becomes their residence, their dwelling for a while, and so then they're again protected in that situation. And so then this is who's protected, where they're protected, and then on the flip side, though, not all housing providers have to follow these laws. Technically, I was just talking to this gentleman, where he actually does not have to follow these laws. So California, so the federal law basically says these laws are supposed to govern people in the business of providing housing, people who are doing this for money purposes. So they, under the federal law, if you have less than 4 properties that you rent out, you can do whatever you want. California, though, again, is on our side with regard to these laws. They've narrowed that exception so that almost everybody is covered, and the one and only exception is if a landlord has 1 unit or 1 room that they rent out and they live on site. So if you have a house and you rent out 2 rooms, you have to comply with these laws. So almost everybody does. In his instance, he has a duplex and he lives on the other side, so that's why he's not covered. Are there any questions, by the way? I have a tendency to talk quickly, so let me know. Yeah.
I was wondering, like, if you have a dwelling and you're renting out 2 rooms, and as a landlord, are behaving fine, but one of your tenants is being, it's basically just, is behaving badly towards the other tenant, what happens then?
And
do you have any responsibility?
you would, as a landlord, you would actually have a responsibility. It's almost a paternalistic way of looking at it, but a landlord is supposed to provide safe, decent housing for people, and so absolutely, if one neighbor is harassing another, intimidating, the landlord definitely has to do something about it. They have to know about it, though. So there's a minimum barrier. You have to provide a complaint, give your landlord notice, and then yes, the landlord does have to do something about it. Yeah.
What if the situation with the funny hair color or something affects the ability to rent the other place, the other rooms in the apartment? So that affects the landlord's ability to generate income, even though it's technically not legal to discriminate.
Well, so I've definitely heard landlords bring that claim and say, I want this person out because everyone else is just moving out of their own accord because they don't want to live near this person. I'm pretty unsympathetic to that, and I think in many instances they're not actually going to leave. We do a lot of different types of advocacy in my group. We do a lot of education, a lot of just negotiation and communicating and connecting the 2 parties, making sure they understand their rights and their obligations. And I think in that instance, that's the kind of approach we would take, because if we just let the landlord continue those negative stereotypes, and get away with that, then that other person with the brightly colored hair has their rights have been impinged upon, and they haven't been able to find a place. So yeah, really briefly, one thing Stephanie is reminding me. Yeah, that would be great. So as a nonprofit organization, we receive a lot of funding from local contracts, and there's a lot of strings attached to that funding. And one of the things they ask is that whenever we present for a group, if we can have everyone sign in, and then I have evaluations at the end. So there is a sign-in sheet that Stephanie's going to pass around.
Name and city of residence.
Mm-hmm. And the city of residents is because the city of San Jose only wants us to serve San Jose residents. But luckily, we also receive funding from Cupertino and Palo Alto and all the other cities. But that's why it matters. They only want to help their own. But yeah, so, so you had a question back there?
Yeah, what if you have a neighbor who has an illegal garage apartment in the backyard and has got dogs that bark all night?
What can you do about it? So there's a couple of things there. So first of all, if it's a and so if there's an illegal unit, then they technically, it's not a dwelling and they don't have to follow the laws, and typically then the people who are renting out that space are incredibly desperate for any place that they'll even live in that illegal unit, that they also don't really want to, put up a fuss either. So we kind of are hands off in those situations, because we ultimately want people to remain in their housing. We care about their housing discrimination, their fair housing rights. We want them to stay in their housing. But you, as a person who's over here and is annoyed by the noise and whatever, I mean, you can call the police. There's code enforcement, which every city has code people that will come out and they'll deal with code violations, which are typically things like too much waste or, plumbing issues or, those kind of things. So maybe, code might be an option. Is this a hypothetical or a personal question? Okay. Well, we can also talk more after. Yeah. Well, in either way, it doesn't sound like it's dealing with housing discrimination. It just sounds like the challenges we all face living near other people. But. One more question, then I'm going to continue so I don't keep you guys over.
Restrictions on the manner in which credit checks may be used to filter applicants for housing?
Well, so typically, the point of a credit check is to make sure that a person is, financially sound, to rent the place, and that's fine. And I think with regards to credit checks and those kind of things, my main concern is when it affects people who, are legal immigrants and might not, have a social security number or, whatever they need in order to run that credit check. And that's a separate issue. In those instances, we ask housing providers to provide a couple of options. We understand they want to verify the person's credit, but if this person can show in other ways they have decent credit, maybe having an employer, write a statement showing pay stubs, bank statements, there's other ways to kind of get them what the landlord wants, the assurance that they want. Does that answer your question? Okay. So just going on then. Let's see. Oh, and I just looked and on my screen it says plain animation. I was like, what's the animation? Oh my gosh. Okay. So briefly, there's two main types of discrimination. The first one is one that most people are probably aware of. It's disparate treatment or differential treatment, and it's intentional. Back in the day, and the reason why these laws were created, landlords would put up a sign saying only whites here, or no blacks allowed. Things as explicit as that and as intentional as that. So that's one of the main types of discrimination. Or again, you can see right there, treating one person or group of people differently because of their membership in that protected class or because of a status that they have that is protected from discrimination against, and which has a negative result for that person. The second type currently still exists, but there's actually a Supreme Court case pending right now that may remove the second one from being a type of discrimination claim that we can bring, unfortunately. So the second type is disparate impact or effect. So it's described as unintentional, but I don't think it's always unintentional. So essentially it's where there's a policy that on its face appears to be neutral. It seems like it applies to everybody across the board without calling out a particular group of people, but it has the effect of negatively treating a certain group of people. So for instance, the case I'm going to talk about in a little bit, there was a housing provider that required everybody to go, in order to live at this place, they had to go to church and devotional activities, and they not only did they have to go to these classes, and I'll talk more about it, but they actually had to be open to God and open to religion. So that policy, applied to everybody. Everybody everybody had to attend these classes, but it had the negative effect of strongly discouraging anybody who wasn't religious from, applying for that housing while they were looking for housing. So that's one example of that. There's a lot of them. And the problem or the concern that people who, care about fair housing are concerned if we lose this second type of discrimination claim is that people are smart these days. They know not to say outright, I'm not going to rent to you because, so instead they craft a rule that will have the effect of discouraging a certain group of people, which is illegal, or flat out discriminating against a particular group of people. So we'll see. If you're interested, the case is Mount Holly. You might hear about it in the news. It actually has been in the news a fair amount, so we'll see. So these, when this comes up, are a couple of small exceptions in addition to the housing provider exception of having to be a bigger housing provider. These are a couple of other particular exemptions from having to comply with these laws, particular groups. So the first one I talked about is the owner-occupied single-family house, which has one room rented. And you can see, though, on the right, even in that instance, they cannot discriminate in terms of advertising. So discriminatory statements are always, whether written or verbal, are always illegal. The second one is qualified senior housing. That's probably a little bit more obvious. If it's housing for elderly people, it's okay for them to say we're not going to allow children here. The third one is one that's more pertinent for today, and it's religious and private organizations. They have an exemption, but it's a very small one, and my next slide is going to talk about it. And so most people, I'd say, and most entities that call themselves a religious faith-based organization are not exempted under here. It has to be like a group that their mission is related to religion as their sole purpose, and then they're allowed to provide their services just to their own people. And then educational dormitories is probably another one that it makes more sense, obviously. You can have a male dorm versus a female dorm, and that's not illegal. And then also same-sex roommate households. So this one, I'd say my friends ask me about the most when they're posting Craigslist ads for roommates. And in that instance, there's a case from maybe about 5 years ago now, a Supreme Court case that outlined this and said that, when you are sharing intimate space with someone, maybe a bathroom, kitchen, common living area. In that instance, because you're so close to them, we're actually going to let you, put more restrictions on terms of who you're going to choose as a roommate. And so that's, that one exception there. And I guess right now, actually, it just says single sex, so we actually need to update this. But yeah, so in general, in a roommate situation, you are unfortunately allowed to discriminate, or you don't have to follow these laws. So this is a little bit more, and I pulled the piece from the law about the religious organization or private club exemption. And you can see that, and I think part of the reason too, that, so not only does it have to be an association, I think it says someone here, the words, all about religion, but it's also, if they're a religious organization that has this housing for a purpose other than a commercial purpose. So again, they're not in the business of providing housing. In this instance, they can actually discriminate in terms of who they choose to rent or provide their housing to. And I guess the reason why I also pulled this out is because the case that brought me here today was a group that said, we are a faith-based organization. And so they were trying to argue, and we anticipate we're filing this case in a couple of weeks. We anticipate their first defense is going to be, we don't have to follow the law. We're under the religious organization exemption, but they're not actually. So I am briefly. How am I on time, Brian? By the way. Okay. So then I might go a little more quickly here through some of this stuff. As I mentioned briefly, discriminatory advertising. Something's in writing that explicitly either shows a preference for a certain group, discourages a certain group, those things would be illegal. So I'm actually going to skip this right now. And there's unfortunately I have a lot of stuff on here. There's a lot of different parts in the process where we want people to be aware that they have fair housing rights. Some of the obvious are refusal to rent, right at the outset. Also direct inquiry. This is going to come up when I talk about my case too, because we have people we sent out to this property, to this faith-based property, and they were asked right off the bat, oh, are you religious? What religion are you? Even asking that question was not a good idea on their part and could be discriminatory. Let's see. This, for some reason, okay. So this is just during tenancy. Again, you also have rights here not to experience unequal treatment. And also if you receive an eviction for a reason that seems discriminatory. Also intimidation, threats, those kind of things are illegal. So these are a little bit more about certain groups that are protected. And again, I'm going to go really quickly through this and jump to the religion one. Okay. All right, this looks a little different than I'm used to. So religious limitations is, based on the idea that people, regardless of, what their religious views are or lack thereof, that they should be able to, again, find housing and fully enjoy their housing. We had this part in here about neighbor-to-neighbor discrimination. It was a big thing, right after 9/11, where, there was a lot of animus against, terrorists, and people conflated, terrorists with anyone from the Middle East and conflated it with Muslims. And there was a lot of harassment, like you mentioned, the neighbor-to-neighbor harassment, where, we became involved and said, the landlord has to do something here. They have to stop something here so both people can fully enjoy their housing unmolested, unbothered. So this case that I'm going to talk about today here, it actually walked through our doors not as a religion case. Actually, it's a disability discrimination case. So this home that we were looking into, they're a faith-based home, faith-based program, but also for people with different types of issues. It was a sober living environment specifically. And we had a person who had mental health issues and also was trying to become sober, and they were discriminated in the housing. And so my organization was contacted because we also undergo investigation. So we really help get evidence to either prove or disprove discrimination, because as you can probably imagine, discrimination cases are not easy to prove. It's not easy to prove the intent, the ideas going through a person's head when they take certain action. Especially, as I said, these days people are a little bit smarter and they know to keep those things to themselves. So my organization helps to get evidence of discrimination. So in this case, one way that we get evidence is by having people go undercover, as we call them, testers. So we'll have them simulate a housing transaction, and then write a narrative, reporting back to us about their experience. And so we typically do our tests as paired tests. It's not unlike a science experiment where you have one tester. Our first tester typically is a person who has the protected status that we want to test. And then we have a second person go close in time right after them that is, across the board, very, very similar in terms of income, gender, ethnicity, everything. And the one thing that's different is, they don't have that protected status. So if it's a disability discrimination case, we'll send someone with a disability, and then we'll send someone who's able-bodied. And we have them go close in time, so there's not intervening things that could explain the different treatment. And that has been determined by the Supreme Court to be very strong evidence of discrimination. And so we do this a lot. A lot of people, are skeptical and said, you're kind of lying. Is how you're kind of luring the people to, discriminate. But basically, the Supreme Court has said, no, this is the only way we can actually get evidence to figure out what's really going on here. So it's okay. So then again, in this case, since it started out as a disability discrimination case, we sent out our first tester was a social worker calling on behalf of an individual with disabilities and just inquiring about information at this property. And in the response, the manager went on and on about how it was a Christ-based property and that people there needed to be looking for religion. And so that was kind of the first red flag for us. And maybe there's a little bit more here, besides disability discrimination. And our tester, actually, these are just ordinary people that we use who do their tests for us. She actually said she felt a little bit uncomfortable when they were asking those questions. She didn't think they were relevant. And she said, just, personally, if someone said that stuff to me, it might be a little bit of a turnoff for me. So again, after that red flag, our second tester we'd already sent out, and they were just calling on behalf of a non-disabled person, and they were told right off the bat, they were asked, are you religious? And so again, I said that raises another red flag for us whenever they ask that question, because why does that matter? You know, what is the landlord going to do with that information? So that paired test were the two little red flags for us that there might be a religious discrimination case here. And then our first tester had also learned actually that they were going to open a second home, and they were looking for a manager for the home. The landlord was very, very chatty. And so we thought, this might be interesting. Let's see if we call back and have someone who's interested in being a manager, what kind of questions are going to ask that person? Are they also going to, this might be, you know, not only a housing discrimination case, but an employment discrimination case if they require their manager to be religious. So we did the follow-up test, and our tester was told that the manager needed to be strong in ministry and have integrity, which also kind of bothers me and probably can bother you guys too. You know that idea too, that if you don't have religion, you can't have integrity, you can't be a moral person. And also, one of the attorneys that I've been working on this case was saying we also assume that's kind of like a euphemism, for strong in ministry and having integrity. Those are both euphemism for religious. Essentially, are you religious? So that was the result of the first test, and then we wanted to probe a little bit farther to kind of parse out. So okay, they obviously are Christ-centered as they express to our testers, but how would they feel about someone who isn't a Christian? So we wanted to test that piece as well. And so that's also, so it was a while before I realized that this was actually a religious case discriminating against atheists. Because at first I thought that maybe it was just Christians is all they wanted, and anyone else they would refuse. So our next paired test, our first tester, so again, having the person who we isolated in terms of the piece we wanted to test, we had them be an atheist, and we had them call up, and they were told that they could not attend those devotional classes. I said there were daily classes from a historical or cultural perspective. They literally had to be open to religion, and as our tester asked follow-up questions, the manager said, I think this isn't the place for you. And again, that's not a flat-out denial, but that's pretty strong discouragement of the person. And in real life, if someone heard that, they probably would give up. They probably wouldn't pursue living there. So that's what happened with atheists, and then matching up with them, our non-protected person, we had a person who was Muslim, and we just wanted to see what response they would get. And they were told that all tenants must have a relationship with God. So we got more information just reaffirming that they definitely want people who are religious. And they also actually had no problem with the Muslims. So they were like and everyone spoke to the exact same landlady. And to our fourth test, the landlady went on and on about how, it's great, whatever religion you are, we all really believe the same thing, we all believe in God, etc. And so at that point, we realized that we had a case here where it was just atheists that was being discriminated against in the type of case we had here. So that is what this case is about, that we're about to file. That I think will be a pretty big case. We have a lot of more testing evidence than we often do on cases. And there is an employment piece. And so having this case also made me realize that probably a lot of people don't know that you're protected from being non-religious under the religious protection category of the housing discrimination laws. So that's why I was here today. And I think most of what's up here, I actually just mentioned some of the pieces that came out that were distressing to us when we did this investigation. But if you're interested in this kind of thing in general, there was also, I listed here at the bottom, a recent case by another group in California where, and they won, and it was a strong case where it was religious discrimination against non-religious people. It was, I think it was a shelter in that case where they were doing the same kind of thing, forcing people to attend classes, asking questions about their religion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So a lot of those sober things are 12-step programs, and one of the steps is surrender to a higher power. So suppose you said, I'm an atheist and I want to get sober, I want to do the 12-step thing, but I don't want to do that.
Huh. Well, that's really interesting. And so I wonder, though, if it was officially one of those 12-step programs, I wonder if it would fall under that group exemption, a little bit more strongly. And so I think the question there would be, are they just kind of, analogizing or, adopting that program, or are they, in fact, this 12-step program that can do their own thing? Like the Boy Scouts are another example of a group that can discriminate in certain instances because they're this closed membership group. Does that kind of answer your question, or no? You puzzled. So basically, there's certain groups that are clubs that are very restricted and exclusive you have to be a member of, and in those instances, you could discriminate. So I'm wondering if an official AA or one of those type of groups, NA group, that follow the 12-step program, if they might be able to actually say you have to follow this program.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't have any direct experience.
Yeah.
My understanding is that at their meetings,
Mm-hmm.
everybody can come to the meetings, but then you're expected to follow the 12 steps.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think then the question too would be, are they also providing housing? Is it getting in the way of something where they can't, because right, if you show up at the meeting, you
well,
yeah.
that's what it sounds
Yeah.
like. You're saying that the person who brought this case to your attention was trying to get sober and that they got this
Mm-hmm.
involved in that, and so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and so, yeah, I'm curious. I might look into that for you. But yeah, another question?
What prevents this landlord from saying, okay, if you want to rent here, you have to become a member of my club, and then I can make you cool that one?
Because, and it's not that clear, even though I pulled the bit there, but it's a very precise legal definition of what counts as a club that's allowed to discriminate. So it has to be pretty narrow. Yeah, Brian? Yeah.
So you can just maybe wrap up with like a call to action. Like what
Sure.
would we do if we felt we were being discriminated against? What would be our next step?
Yeah. I mean, definitely, I always encourage people to call me. I was telling this gentleman at the beginning that our organization, we're nonpartisan and we're here to provide information about the laws and help everybody follow the laws. So we always want people to call us to say, if you have any personal questions, call us. If you hear of anything that sounds suspicious, let us know. Because also one of the great things about my organization, since we're a nonprofit, is that we can take action on our own. A lawyer can only take action on behalf of a person who's been injured who comes to them. But if we find out about someone in the community that is discriminating, we can file a lawsuit. We can file a complaint. So report stuff to us. Let us know about stuff. Tell your friends about us. Those are the main ways. Because I think a lot of people don't know about these laws. Just talking about us. Yeah, those are the main things. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to point out on my slides here. I guess, are there any other questions? Because these are just, I guess, going to the protected categories. But I guess one of the key things, too, is you should contact us if you even just have a weird feeling about something. Because, as I said, one of our main jobs is to investigate and to see if we can gather evidence for cases. Okay. I guess that's it. I'll stop right there. So, thank you guys so much. I'm sorry I kept you guys for a while. But